worked years on it and you perfected it and you love it and you believe in it, push it.
Hi, I'm Vinnie Corbo, publisher at Volossal Publishing, and I'm here with Cathy Gigante-Brown, longtime Volossal author, and we're really happy to have you here, Cathy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things that Cathy does that I think everyone would find very interesting is that she is probably one of the hardest, what we call DIY workers for her own promotion, meaning that she has used public readings at bookstores and coffee houses, and she has also used the internet to get herself reviews and a variety of things, articles. She's also found other ways to slip in through the back door using other elements of what's going on in her life. So I think she's an excellent role model for anybody who's looking to write their own books and promote their own books, because we know in this day and age, you could hire a publicist, and by the time you pay them, there goes any profit that you may have made.
Right.
So one of the let's dive in right away. One of the first things you do is you do the bookstore readings. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got that going?
Right. I did very local bookstores in Brooklyn. I started with those. And one thing, maybe because I'm Italian American, but I always had food there. Cookies. I'd always bake cookies. And I read this article that said it's something that women authors do. I don't know why. And then I did also venues like the Italian American Museum in Little Italy, and I actually catered there. I brought in some food from Avella's, this wonderful dairy place that's been there like a million years. And so there was antipasto. So I read about antipasto and we ate antipasto, and I made cookies and made my own roasted peppers. So I think writing is so personal. It's really cool to bring yourself into it. So that's what one of the things I do. And I also kind of go in the back door with different venues to kind of get your book out there. Like I'm a registered Facebook user on different Italian American sites. So you can't openly promote your book on these sites and say, buy my book. But you can make a comment when somebody posts a picture of their nonna, and you could say, oh, that looks just like my great grandmother who I immortalized in books. Yeah. And then someone will say, oh, what books? And so then you have the avenue where you could say, well, I wrote something called The L about my great grandparents in Borough Park. So there's kind of your back door.
Right.
We like back doors.
Well, and that you took the Eric Cartman approach, who said, tell people remember they're having that meeting and they said, and Eric Cartman says, there'll be punch and pie. And they're like, why? And he says, because more people will come if there's punch and pie. And
exactly.
So, yeah, Jackie and I always say that all the time now. More people will come if there's punch and pie. And you are an excellent cook. It's one of the other things you bring to the table. So they're not showing up for lousy food. They're showing up for excellent food, but they're showing up for the punch and pie. And I also think that that's a really interesting thing that you offer, because so much of all of your books, but especially the L trilogy, contains a considerable amount of food in it. Food references, food descriptions. Food is part of the culture. Food is a big part of Italian culture and a lot of other cultures. So even if you're not Italian American, it's one of the things that is relatable across the board. So by introducing food into your presentations, it makes sense.
I think so. And a lot of big reveals in the book happen in all the books, I think, happen when women are preparing food in the kitchen, when they're doing cleaning up after, and there's a lot of conversation that goes on. And that's the way it is in an Italian household. And people say, Jewish people say like, oh, it's just so much like my family. And so I think a lot of different cultures can relate. And one of my friends, Daryl's was African American, he was like, oh, it reminds me so much of my Uncle Ray and things that happened with my family. And, we're all similar at our base. Everybody has to eat, everybody loves, everybody fights. So it's all in my books, I guess.
Well, then, and it's true, because you do capture, I mean, yes, it is an Italian American family, and you definitely capture that. And I'd say in many ways, I hate to use the word better, but let's just say differently than something like The Sopranos. When we talk about The Sopranos versus The Godfather, I always say that The Godfather reminds me much more of the way that my family was. The Sopranos was such a caricature. It's just not real to me, and it was kind of annoying. Your books really do capture that feeling, that of that culture of a real family. And you could say it could be any family, but it really does capture some of the very specific cultural things, I think, in a very genuine way. Would you agree?
I think so. I really do. It's what I saw growing up, and it's the L especially was based on stories that my father told me about his family growing up. And I learned a lot, like sitting around the table with my grandmother, helping her put together Monogot, just like Tiger does, and then just like Stan does with his grandmother. And there's a lot that goes on when women are supposedly like washing dishes. A lot of gossip, a lot of things happen. Yeah. And like the world just kind of goes on around a kitchen table and a dining room table. So I try to capture that.
Yeah. They other movies have tried to do that. Can you think of any off the top of your head that you think got it right?
I think A Big Night, even though it takes place in a restaurant, but it's just what goes on. It's the bustle that goes on. So that's one that really stands out. I can't think of any others.
What about, how did you feel about the Green Book, even though a lot of it didn't take place, but they did have like the family interacted around the table.
Right. They did capture the family dynamic really well in Green Book without being stereotypical. Yeah. I think they did a really good job with that.
I mean, it as close to not being stereotypical. I mean, everything has to be blown up for the movies and television, but yeah, I thought that was pretty reasonable too. That's why I felt all along that this series would translate to the screen at some point in time, and maybe at some point in time we get there. Then you also have the downside, which is everybody says, it's never quite as good as a book. And that's often true because our imaginations tend to be better than what we see, because we can tailor the characters. I have my own vision of what Tiger looks like. So, as soon as you put that person on the screen, and it's like, oh, well, that's it. And I think, I know that Jackie felt this way about 50 Shades when she saw the guy. She was like, oh, wait a minute, that's not who I pictured. And I think all around the world, every woman pictured that guy the way they wanted him to look. And so oftentimes that's why books tend to be better. But at the same time, I do think the L would translate well to something on the screen. I think actually all of your books would, in a lot of ways, more than other books that I've read. Like yours, it just feels like the transition would be actually relatively easy.
Thank you. I would love that. I really would. And it's easier in a book because you have so much more space. I mean, there's no limit to the amount of pages. You have 400, 300 pages, but a screenplay, like a typical 2-hour screenplay, is like only 120 pages. So you have to take out like the little gems and the little details. Yeah. So it's tough to translate a book to the screen, but I would love to do it if somebody wants to give me a chance.
Somebody write me a check.
Write me a check, I'll do it.
Okay. So the first bit of advice to authors that are, on the DIY journey, whether you're self-publishing or publishing with an indie publisher like Volossal, you have to do self-promotion. You
Right.
know, and even if you were with a major label, talk to any of my friends on major record labels and they'll tell you, yeah, they do promotion and they throw you here and there, but they really, you don't have much control over what happens, and you still should do your own. So the first thing you're saying is you go to local bookstores and bring some food, or bring something
Right.
that draws people in. Maybe it's something that has to do with your book in particular. So maybe you wrote a book about cars, or there's something about cars in your book, and you could go to maybe go to an auto show or some kind of thing. You know, the Volkswagen community has huge things all across the country. So if you showed up there with something about Volkswagens and your book was there too, it's like, oh, and by the way, I have this book. So if people kind of like you, then they'll be more inclined to to want to dig deeper into who you are and what you've created. So
Right.
that's Cathy Brown, tip number 1, bring food.
And also tip number 2, I think, is like, it's almost become cliche, but think outside the box. Because I've also gone to venues like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because in the L, a lot of it takes place in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so I read a passage about the Navy Yard where my great grandfather worked in the Navy Yard, with cranes behind me and ships behind me. And so, you know, you look at little niches like that, like you said about the car show, or, you know, I talk about vintage cars like the Nash, or, you know, old Buicks and Bel Airs. And so just don't limit yourself. Also in the Brooklyn Roses, I talk a lot about New Haven, Connecticut, and part of it takes place in Connecticut. So go to local papers, you know, go to local newspapers and offer to have an excerpt of your book published there. And, you know, they love it. It's a free story. They don't really have to do much to it.
Right. So that's another thing that you have done very successfully, is you've contacted quite a number of online periodicals and online blogs and newspapers. I mean, you've actually got stuff in actual print.
Right.
For those of you watching at home, a newspaper is a large thing of paper with print on it, and they open it up and you read stories. The older folks enjoy these. Now they go in bird cages, but to get in there is not easy, and you've managed to do that. And so maybe elaborate a little bit more on how you went about, like, what do you say in your correspondence to kind of get your foot in the door, to them even look who you are?
Right. Well, I start with kind of the draw, like the kicker of why it would be a good match for them. You know, like, oh, you're a newspaper that about New Haven. Well, I have this chapter that takes place in New Haven in the 1960s, and I think it would be a great match. So you just kind of try to seduce them in the first paragraph. And so that's something you do. Also, you just look for little kind of ins, like I was over 50 when I published the L with you. So there was a magazine called Better Over 50. And I just pitched them on, you know, She Did It. They have a little column, and it was like, hey, I published my first novel at 50.
Yeah. So these are great ideas that a lot of people wouldn't think of, but these are all very helpful. Finding other things, because what I often tell the authors is, if you just call a place or contact in, like, I wrote a book, who cares? So is a billion other people. So I'll give you a good example. Letty Orgazorko, Manginelli, she wrote a book on tamales. Mm-hmm. And instead of just saying, I wrote a book on tamales, she went to a morning show. She said, I'll do a tamale demonstration on your morning show. And they were super happy to have that. And they teach the hosts, you know, how to make the tamales. And then they show her a book. Amazing. So yeah, that's definitely a thing. You offer something.
Also, your newest author, I think, Yael, and her book about adoption.
Right.
She's been getting such great press on from a Jewish press about adoption. She just did something that I tuned in on Instagram, where she was interviewed by a woman in New Zealand that has an Instagram page about adoption. So just, you know, any little niche that you have, just, you know, work it. You know, be like
Yeah.
a stripper, strut and work your body,
And
work
no
your
one's
butt.
going to do this for you. That's the big message. You know, Yael, again, she's very proud of her book, and as well she should be.
Yeah, it's a great book. And also it's something that you're so passionate about and you worked so hard on. I know so many authors say like, oh, you know, I want to get my book published, but I'm not going to promote it. I'm like, you worked years on it and you perfected it and you love it and you believe in it. Push it. You know, you're proud of it. You have every right to be proud. So just, you know, talk about it, share it. People are interested to hear about it, especially, you know, in the pandemic. I remember we had a conference before I published, we did Brooklyn Roses together. I was like, is it a good idea to get a book out in the middle of a pandemic? I can't go to bookstores and all that. And you were like, people need stuff like your books in a pandemic. And I think it was a really good idea.
So that's a couple points from Cathy Gigante-Brown, author of The L, The Bells of Brooklyn,
Yes.
Brooklyn Roses, the trilogy. That's the first trilogy by Volossal, by the way. She's also written a book called Better Than Sisters.
A different drummer.
A different drummer.
Which we are still working to make into a musical. It's almost there. It's pretty much written, and we just need. Then the pandemic hit. We had a really good contact, and the pandemic hit, and Broadway closed down. So we're still hoping to get that going one of these days, and we still have some irons in the fire, as they say.
Yeah. So we'll say hi to Susan and Hannah. Hey, get back to work.
I know Susan's waiting. She's ready.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can see you again.
Thanks.